It was a quiet Tuesday morning at the county courthouse in Springfield. The usual buzz of lawyers, clerks, and bailiffs filled the halls, but inside courtroom 3B, something unusual was about to unfold. Judge Robert Harlan, known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach to justice, took his seat behind the bench. His robe was perfectly pressed, his gavel polished. He was ready for another day of hearings. The room filled quickly. A few journalists had shown up, tipped off about a curious case on the docket. A man named Michael Dawson, a homeless veteran, was scheduled to appear on charges of public disturbance and trespassing. Nothing major, but something about the arrest report had caught the attention of local media. He had been found sleeping behind a downtown church, clutching a worn duffel bag, muttering something about a mission, a promise, and a name that didn't show up on any police record. The bailiff called out, "Case number 2457, the state versus Michael Dawson." Heads turned as a frail man in his late 60s shuffled into the courtroom, hands cuffed in front of him. His hair was gray and unkempt, beard thick and weathered. His clothes were torn, but he stood with a dignity that seemed out of place for someone in his condition. Judge Harlan looked up and paused for a moment. There was something oddly familiar about this man. He scanned the case file, glanced back at Dawson, then nodded. "Mr. Dawson," he began, "you're being charged with trespassing and creating a public disturbance. How do you plead?" Michael raised his head, met the judge's eyes, and softly replied, "Not guilty, Your Honor. But if you'll let me speak, I'll tell you everything." The courtroom fell silent after Michael Dawson's calm but resolute voice echoed through the chamber. Even Judge Harlan seemed momentarily taken aback. Typically, defendants facing minor charges pled quickly and moved on. But this man, he spoke with purpose. "Mr. Dawson," the judge said, narrowing his eyes slightly, "this is not a trial. This is an arraignment. If you have something to say, it should be discussed with your legal counsel." "I understand, Your Honor," Michael said, "but I don't have a lawyer. I waived my right to one. I don't want to waste anyone's time. I just need 10 minutes to explain why I was there, and maybe someone in this room will understand." Judge Harlan sat back, tapping his pen against the desk. The courtroom buzzed quietly with murmurs. The prosecutor, a young woman named Rachel Monroe, glanced at the judge with mild annoyance, whispering, "Your Honor, if we may proceed." But something in Judge Harlan hesitated. He gestured for silence and leaned forward. "10 minutes," he said firmly. "That's all you get. Make it count." Michael nodded slowly, taking a breath. "I wasn't just sleeping behind that church," he began. "I was looking for someone who saved my life years ago. You see, I served in the 82nd Airborne during Desert Storm, and back then I made a promise. A promise to a man who gave everything so that I could come home." The judge's brow furrowed. A flicker of something, recognition, flashed across his face. Michael continued, his voice steady but emotional. "I've spent years trying to keep that promise, and when I ended up behind that church, it wasn't by accident. I was following a lead. A final clue." The courtroom leaned in as Michael Dawson's voice filled the space, steady, but carrying the weight of memory. Even the stenographer momentarily paused her keystrokes, mesmerized. "It was February 1991, Michael said, staring straight ahead, eyes not seeing the room but the past. "We were deep in the desert, a small recon unit cut off from our main force. We were ambushed. I remember the smoke, the screams, the confusion." He stopped for a moment, collecting himself. Judge Harlan didn't interrupt. "There were 5 of us. By the time the dust settled, only 2 made it out alive. Me and Staff Sergeant James Cole. He was the one who pulled me from the wreckage, with shrapnel in his own leg. I was bleeding bad. I thought I was done. But he didn't let me go. He carried me 2 miles to safety through enemy fire." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even Rachel Monroe, the prosecutor, had softened her posture, no longer glancing at her watch. Michael continued, voice cracking slightly. "Before we were evacuated, James made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd find his family. He didn't have much. No parents left. No siblings. Just a young wife back in Ohio. He made me swear that I'd tell her how brave he was, that he died saving someone. Michael looked up again, directly at the judge. But I never got the chance. They told me he didn't make it through surgery. I was in recovery for months. When I got out, I searched. I wrote letters. I made calls. But the trail went cold. He paused. Until a week ago. That church. Someone there mentioned her name. That's why I was there. The courtroom remained hushed. No one stirred. Even the bailiff stood perfectly still, arms folded, eyes locked on Michael Dawson. Michael glanced down at his hands, the cuffs cold around his wrists. I didn't go behind that church to cause trouble, he said quietly. One, because I heard the pastor knew her, James's wife. After all these years, I finally had a name. Emily Cole. Judge Harlan suddenly sat upright. The name hit him like a thunderclap. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to the case file, then back to the man standing before him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Michael didn't notice the judge's reaction. His focus was locked inward, lost in the weight of years. I was cold, tired. I didn't mean to fall asleep out back. I'd planned many of which now showed signs of guilt, curiosity, or even shame. I know what I look like. I know people see a bum, a troublemaker. But I made a promise to a dying man, and I wasn't about to break it. Judge Harlan cleared his throat, his voice suddenly dry. Mr. Dawson, did you say Emily Cole? Michael looked up, startled. Yes, sir. That was her name. Do you know her? The judge hesitated. A wave of emotion washed over his usually unreadable face. Yes, I do, he said softly. I knew James Cole very well. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Judge Harlan sat still, his hands slightly trembling as they rested on the bench. The entire courtroom felt the shift. The room was no longer just a place of law, but a space of memory, grief, and unfinished stories. I was James Cole's commanding officer, Judge Harlan finally said, his voice heavy. I served with him, and I was there the day we lost him. Michael's eyes widened. He stepped forward instinctively before the bailiff gently reminded him to stay in place. I didn't recognize your name at first, the judge continued. But now, hearing you speak, it's all coming back. You were the private we airlifted out that night. You were unconscious, barely alive. We never thought you'd make it. Michael swallowed hard. I didn't know you were there, sir. I was, Harlan nodded slowly. I remember James carrying you through the dunes, refused to stop, refused to let go. We found him collapsed just outside the perimeter, with you slung over his shoulder. He died a hero, and a brother. The weight of those words hung heavy. Rachel Monroe, the prosecutor, lowered her gaze. Even she seemed moved beyond her legal role. She turned to Judge Harlan and softly said, Your Honor, in light of this testimony, I'd like to recommend we dismiss the charges. This man doesn't belong here. The judge didn't speak right away. He stared at Michael with a look that mixed recognition, sorrow, and something close to admiration. Motion granted, he said hoarsely, then turned to the bailiff. Remove his cuffs. As the bailiff stepped forward, Judge Harlan stood and slowly came down from the bench, a rare move in any courtroom. He walked up to Michael Dawson and looked him in the eye. You kept your promise, he said, his voice breaking. Judge Harlan stood face to face with Michael Dawson, in front of a courtroom full of silent onlookers. The sound of the handcuffs unlocking echoed like a thunderclap. The bailiff gently removed them, and Michael rubbed his wrists, not in pain but in disbelief. You kept your promise, the judge repeated, voice thick with emotion. James would have been proud. Michael looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure anyone remembered him. I wasn't sure I was even going to find her. But I couldn't stop, not after what he did for me. The judge reached into his pocket. He opened it slowly and revealed an old black and white image. 5 soldiers standing in a sun-scorched desert, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Michael gasped. That's us, he said. That's our unit. I've carried it every day since, Judge Harlan said quietly. I never forgot. I just didn't expect to see anyone from that chapter of my life ever again. By now, many in the courtroom had tears in their eyes. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. There were no objections, no legal arguments, only a room full of people witnessing something far more powerful than law. "Do you know where Emily is?" Michael asked gently. The judge nodded. "She lives just a few miles from here. She never remarried. She volunteers at a shelter downtown, works with veterans. She's never stopped hoping to hear about James's last moments." Michael blinked back tears. "Then I need to tell her. She deserves to know the truth, to hear how brave he really was." "And you will," the judge said. "I'll take you myself." The court had officially recessed, but no one moved. Judge Harlan placed a hand on Michael Dawson's shoulder, guiding him gently out of the courtroom. Michael looked back once more, almost in disbelief. Moments ago, he had been a homeless man facing criminal charges. Now he was being escorted by a judge, no longer as a defendant but as a guest. Outside, the crisp afternoon air greeted them. Judge Harlan led Michael to his car, an old but well-maintained Ford Crown Victoria. The judge opened the passenger door with a small nod. "Climb in," he said. "We've got someone to see." The drive was quiet at first. Both men were lost in thought. Then, Harlan broke the silence. "You know, after James died, I left the service within a year. I couldn't take the weight of all the names we lost. I thought law would be a clean break, but it's never really left me." Michael nodded. "It doesn't leave any of us. I've spent the last 2 decades drifting. After my discharge, things just fell apart. I never adjusted. I had nightmares, anger issues, and no family to fall back on." "You tried," the judge said, glancing at him. "You kept the one thing that mattered, your word." They passed familiar streets and turned into a quiet neighborhood lined with trees and modest homes. Eventually, they pulled up to a small community center. Children played outside while volunteers carried in boxes. The judge parked, then looked at Michael. "She's inside," he said gently. "Still helps out here every week." Michael took a breath. "Do you think she'll want to see me?" Harlan nodded. "She's waited a long time for this moment." Michael slowly stepped out of the car, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything this day had become. Michael stood for a moment outside the community center, frozen. His heart pounded. This was the moment he had imagined countless times over the years. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would say it, but now that it was real, words seemed far away. Judge Harlan walked beside him, offering steady support without speaking. They stepped through the center's front doors into a warm, welcoming space filled with laughter, chatter, and the scent of fresh coffee. Volunteers bustled about, setting up tables and folding clothes for a donation drive. Then, across the room, Harlan spotted her. "Emily," he called gently. A woman in her early 60s looked up from a stack of boxes. She was still beautiful, with soft eyes and silver hair pulled into a neat ponytail. At first she smiled at Harlan, but her expression changed when she saw the man beside him. Her eyes fixed on Michael Dawson. There was a pause, a single breathless moment that seemed to stretch on forever. "Emily," Michael said softly, voice cracking. "My name is Michael Dawson. I served with James, your husband." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes before a word was spoken. She took a step forward, hand to her chest. He talked about you in the letters," she said. "Said you were like a brother to him." Michael nodded slowly. "He saved my life. I came here to tell you how he died, what he did. He was the bravest man I've ever known, and I never forgot the promise I made to him." Emily covered her mouth as tears fell freely now. She reached out, and Michael took her hands in his. "Thank you," she whispered, breaking into sobs. "You brought him home." Emily and Michael sat together on a bench just outside the community center. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. Judge Harlan stood nearby, arms folded, watching the moment unfold with quiet reverence. Michael cleared his throat, looking at Emily with soft, steady eyes. James was a hero, but not just in the way the medals say. Out there, in the sand, under fire, he was the kind of man who kept everyone together. He didn't yell, he didn't panic, he just believed in doing what was right. Emily nodded slowly, wiping away tears with a tissue. Michael continued. The day we were ambushed, everything went wrong. We were outnumbered. I caught shrapnel in my side and leg. I couldn't walk. I told him to leave me, told him I was a goner. But he looked at me like I was crazy and said, "Not today, Mike. You're going home." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. He carried me across that desert. I blacked out several times, but every time I came to, I could hear him, talking to me, keeping me awake. He wouldn't give up. He dragged me right into the arms of our unit, collapsed the second we reached the line. Emily was silently crying, hands trembling in her lap. They said he died in surgery, Michael whispered. But before they wheeled him away, he made me promise I'd find you, that I'd tell you everything. It took me almost 30 years, but I finally kept that promise. Emily reached over and gently placed her hand on his. You didn't just keep it, she said through tears. You gave me the piece of him I never had, the ending I always needed. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, a quiet peace settled over the community center. Emily, Michael, and Judge Harlan sat together, bonded by a shared loss and a story that had waited decades to be told. You know, Emily said softly, after James died, I never really moved on. I tried to, but a part of me was frozen in that moment. I never knew how he spent his final hours. The military told me he was brave, but it felt hollow. What you gave me today, Michael, it's more than closure. It's healing. Michael nodded, his own eyes misty. He was more than brave. He was the kind of man we all looked up to. I wouldn't be here without him. Judge Harlan finally spoke again, his voice low. I've presided over hundreds of cases in my career, seen the best and worst of humanity. But this is the first time I felt like justice was done, in a way the court can't measure. He looked at Michael with deep sincerity. You didn't just honor your promise to James. You reminded us all what real loyalty, sacrifice, and brotherhood mean. Michael smiled faintly. I wasn't sure if I even belonged anywhere anymore. But today, you both gave me something back, a sense of purpose. Emily reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. James wrote this on the day he deployed. He told me not to open it unless something happened. I never could bring myself to read it. Until now. I think maybe it's time. She offered it to Michael. Will you read it with me? Michael took the letter gently, as though it were sacred. I'd be honored. They opened it together. Under the fading light, a soldier's final words, finally home. Michael carefully unfolded the aged envelope, his hands trembling as he pulled out the letter inside. The paper was yellowed, but James Cole's handwriting remained strong and steady. Michael read aloud, his voice soft and reverent. Dear Emily, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I need you to know this isn't a goodbye, it's a thank you. Thank you for being the light in my life. For loving me when I didn't always know how to love myself. I've always believed that people are put in each other's lives for a reason. And I believe I was meant to love you, to laugh with you, and to fight for the kind of world you deserve. I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to remember me not with sadness, but with pride. And if you ever meet a soldier named Michael Dawson, tell him I said thank you. He's one of the best men I've known. I'd go to hell and back for that kid. He reminds me of the man I wanted to be. If he's reading this with you, it means he made it home. That's enough for me. Love always. James. As Michael finished reading, the silence was so deep, it felt holy. Emily wept openly now, her hand gripping Michael's tightly. Judge Harlan turned away slightly, blinking back his own tears. The weight of the letter hung over them. A final blessing. A message frozen in time. Michael folded the letter with reverence and handed it back to Emily. He loved you so much, he whispered. And he never forgot you, Emily said. Neither will I. That night, something shifted inside Michael Dawson. For years he had wandered the streets feeling like a ghost, unseen, forgotten, burdened by memories he couldn't share. But now, in the warmth of shared grief and healing, he began to feel whole again. Emily invited him to stay for dinner. It wasn't fancy, Just soup, bread, and some quiet conversation. But to Michael, it felt like home. The three of them, Michael, Emily, and Judge Harlan, sat around her kitchen table, not as strangers, but as survivors of the same story. "I don't know what comes next," Michael said after a long pause. "But for the first time in a long time, I want to find out." "You don't have to go it alone," Emily replied, smiling gently. "You have people now, a home if you want it." "I've got some friends at the VA," Judge Harlan added. "We'll get you set up with housing, maybe counseling. You deserve a chance to rebuild." Michael looked down, overwhelmed. "After everything, you really think I can start over?" The judge leaned forward, his tone steady. "You didn't just survive war, Michael. You survived the silence that followed. That takes more strength than most people will ever know. And yes, you can start over. You already have." Later that evening, Michael stepped outside for air. The stars were bright above, clearer than he'd noticed in years. For once, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded photo of his unit that Judge Harlan had given him, and stared at the faces. "You kept me going," he whispered. "Now it's my turn to live." And for the first time in decades, Michael Dawson felt something stir deep in his chest. Hope. Days turned into weeks, and Michael Dawson began settling into a new life, one far removed from alleyways and shelters. With help from Judge Harlan and contacts at the VA, he moved into a modest apartment close to the community center. It wasn't much, but to Michael, it was everything. A bed, a door that locked, and a place to breathe. He started volunteering at the center where Emily worked. At first, it was just small tasks, stacking chairs, sweeping floors, handing out meals. But soon, Michael began speaking to younger veterans, those just returning from service and already feeling the same disorientation he once knew so well. He never preached, he just listened. And when he did speak, his words carried weight because they were carved from lived experience. One afternoon, Emily walked in to find Michael sitting with a young Marine named Tyler. The young man was on the edge, haunted, hollow-eyed, barely holding on. Michael didn't lecture. He simply pulled out the photo again, the one of his old unit. He handed it to Tyler, who stared at the faded faces. "They saved me," Michael said quietly, "when I couldn't walk, when I couldn't even hope. And even after they were gone, they kept saving me. Every single day." Tyler's lips quivered. "You think it ever gets better?" Michael nodded slowly. "Not all at once, but yeah, it can. If you keep going. If you let people help." Emily stood silently in the doorway, watching with quiet pride. Later that evening, she told Michael, "You didn't just keep James's promise. You've made his legacy live on." Michael smiled faintly. "He carried me out of war. Now I carry his light." Months passed, and the cold grip of winter began to ease. Spring breathed life back into the town. Flowers returned to front yards, laughter echoed through the streets, and Michael Dawson, once invisible, had become a quiet force for good. Word of his story had spread, not because he told it, but because others did. The courtroom scene, the promise fulfilled, and the letter from a fallen soldier, it all resonated with people. News outlets ran quiet features, local papers published heartfelt profiles, and soon, other veterans started showing up at the center asking for the man who made it home. One evening, Judge Harlan invited Michael and Emily to a small ceremony at City Hall. "Just a little recognition," he said casually, "nothing fancy." But when they arrived, Michael was stunned. Rows of people filled the room, veterans in uniform, local officials, families, and strangers. A banner read, "Honoring service, honoring promises." At the center stood a framed copy of James Cole's letter and the photo of their unit, now restored and encased in glass. Michael froze. "I don't deserve this." Judge Harlan stepped forward. "You do. This isn't about medals or glory. This is about something most people forget: honor, loyalty, and love that reaches beyond the grave." Emily approached the podium. "My husband died a hero, but today, I gained something I never expected: peace. And that's because of Michael. She turned to him. You gave me my husband's last words. But more than that, you reminded me of the man he truly was. The room stood in quiet applause as Michael stepped forward. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure. Then, with a breath of courage, he faced the crowd. I'm not here because I'm strong, he said. I'm here because someone else was. As the applause faded, Michael stood before the crowd with quiet strength. For a man who had once spoken only to alley walls and forgotten corners, this was a new world, one built not on survival, but on connection, memory, and meaning. I'm not a hero, he said again, voice firm yet humble. But I knew one, and he saved my life. Everything I've done since, I've done in his shadow, hoping I could live up to the man he believed I could be. Silence fell across the room as his words settled like truth in the air. Later that night, Michael stood with Judge Harlan and Emily just outside City Hall. The stars glittered overhead, and the wind carried the soft scent of spring. You think James would have been proud? Michael asked, his voice low. Judge Harlan nodded without hesitation. He'd be proud, and maybe even a little surprised. Not that you kept your word, but that you became something more. A beacon. Emily placed a hand on Michael's arm. You gave my husband peace. Now it's time you find yours. Michael smiled, and for the first time in decades, it reached his eyes. Weeks later, he began working full-time at the community center, helping other veterans find housing, counseling, and a new path forward. He wasn't just another story anymore. He had become a chapter in others' healing. On the anniversary of James's passing, Michael returned to the small cemetery where his friend was buried. He laid a single white rose on the grave and stood in silence. I made it, brother, he whispered. And I'm finally home. The wind stirred the leaves gently as if the world itself were listening. And somewhere, somehow, James was too.